Tonight's show, I'm Art Tamrowski, and tonight at Letchworth State Park, with me is Doug Bassett from the park. Doug?
Good evening, how are you?
Good, Doug. I'm looking forward to our six-part series on items throughout the park that are investigated by you and discussed by you. And as we start tonight, I think we're in a beautiful spot here at the north end, and we're just sort of chatting underneath this beautiful bass tree.
Yeah.
And I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, Doug, and let you go with the information.
Okay, very good. I thought tonight we might look over at the Hogsback and see what that is like. And we're starting right out here underneath a nice basswood tree. The basswood, come take a closer look, has some interesting shaped leaves. This one's being used a lot by insects, and you can see that there are leaf eaters that have chewed a lot of these leaves. In fact, this time of year it's hard to find any leaves that are intact. But when you get a look at one, you can see how lopsided the base is. Basswood tree bark is also a nice rough textured bark. And taking a closer look here, you can see many kinds of lichens. And I just noticed here something quite special. Take a close-up look at here. This is a cicada. You hear the buzzing of a cicada up in the trees on a hot summer day. And they live in the ground down here. And this one has crawled up, maybe from somewhere down at the base of this tree, up to this point, broke out of its back. You can see the remains of the little cicada here. And it's just the empty shell. It's no longer there. A little brooch pin, if you will.
Well, that's interesting.
It's not there anymore. And it has pumped up its wings and left that shell as an adult, and that's the buzzing you hear up in the tree in a warm summer day around noon.
What form is it right now? When it's buzzing?
That's the adult. This is a nymph. It looks like the adult, except it doesn't have wings.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look here on the underside, you can see this little, looks like spear.
Mm-hmm.
That's its mouth part. It cannot chew. It only drinks liquids. In fact, the adult doesn't even have any digestive organs in its abdomen. It's used as a resonating chamber in case of the male to help produce that sound.
Interesting.
So lichens on the tree give it a nice coating, and rougher bark trees often have a great variety of lichens. And also climbing up the tree, since we're going to do a little hike out here and take a closer look at the hogsback, maybe you want to take a closer look at some poison ivy. Poison ivy has the three leaves, and the terminal leaf here is quite symmetrical, but the side leaves have kind of one side fatter than the other. The edges of the leaf can be quite smooth, or they can be quite toothed, and that makes it sometimes hard to recognize. Leaves can be smaller than this, or bigger, light green, or darker green. They usually have some red on the stem, but always have their leaves grouped in three. There are other things, of course, that have leaves in three. You can see a raspberry right here.
Raspberry. Yeah. Can I inhale that and get infected?
If a person is real sensitive to poison ivy, we got a little breeze today, and say you were downwind from the plant and there was some dust in the wind, you could physically get some of that dust hitting the plant, getting the oil on the dust and getting to you. You wouldn't physically have to be touching it. Sometimes people get it for like their pet, their cat, their dog, out in it. They're petting their cat, getting it indirectly. But the oil is long lasting. You can even get it from a dead plant.
Interesting. And if it's burned, if you put a fire to it and it burns and the smoke, can't you get infected from the smoke of the fire of the poison ivy?
The fire doesn't destroy the oil. The oil is carried on those smoke particles. You're breathing in the smoke. A forest firefighter or someone downwind from.
In fact, we'll just do a cutaway of this. You have more to say about the bass tree?
We could. Yeah, as we're leaving, looking back at it, could take a distant look.
So you've got a lot of information on every tree in the park, I'm sure.
There's a lot of trees in the park, over 100 different kinds, and they all have their own life history. There's all kinds of insects that are associated with any given tree. Fungi, lichens, birds that use them, animals, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, lots of interactions.
Okay, you speak like a naturalist. What is your title, Doug?
Yeah, I work as a park naturalist, and my official title is conservation educator here in the park.
Yeah, and you take people on trails all the time.
You betcha.
Yeah.
Yep, thousands of folks in the course of a year.
Okay, you want to take this mic and then just do a little talking about that?
Yeah, sure. The basswood here be a little bit easier to look at when we get a little bit farther away. As we turn around and look back at the tree we were standing on, you can kind of see the silhouette of it. You can see how the branches kind of droop out at the end, sort of downward pointing branches. On a bigger tree, they'll start getting a little upturn at the end. And very large leaves. It's a soft wood used in carving, and it also was a survival food. As people were running out of foods in February, the buds, the bark, all had edible qualities. In fact, the inner bark in the spring can be loosened from the tree and can be twisted into fibers, and those fibers can then be braided into ropes. This was one of the major ropes of the Haudenosaunee, the Senecas that were in this area, and a very useful tree for people as well as the dependent animals that are associated with it. A little walk down here and see what the gorge looks like here at the Hogsback.
You call this the Hogsback.
Yeah.
Are you going to give us a reason why it's called Hogsback?
Yeah, I think when we get out there we might be able to picture the raised hairs on the back of a wild pig and see if it looks like a hog's back.
Okay, I'll follow. Yeah, now this is a mighty view that a lot of people, even from Castile and Perry, aren't even familiar with. Most people just go to the swimming pool and never bother to come to this edge. So maybe you've got some information here, and I bet you do.
That's true. There's a lot of things that you can see from here that you aren't going to see from the road. For example, let's look over the edge right here. There's a duck that just landed on the edge of the river there and is making some waves. The river's flowing towards us here, coming out of the shadows. Off in the distance you can see where a deltal fan of alluvial material that has eroded off the cliff is kind of pushed against the river. When there's been a lot of rain, that's a waterfall is over 200 feet in height. We're a little over 300 feet above the river here. And right in front of us you see a relative of the poison ivy plant. See, it has the three leaves here, the same. This is a fragrant sumac. And the fragrant sumac has an odor to the crushed leaf. You might want to smell this, Art, just to see what you think of it.
Now that's not poison sumac, is it?
No, the poison sumac would have more leaflets and would have white berries and live in a swamp. And this is a cliffside plant. It's usually right on the edge of the cliff. You won't find it usually 20 feet in from.
That's a beautiful fragrance.
Yeah, I like that one. Very pungent.
Mm-hmm.
Another plant that's out here on the edge, you can see the roots of it right here, and that tree is an evergreen, and it's being undercut there by erosion, and those trees are able to survive a long time on these cliffs. Particularly when they're rooted in the rock, they grow quite slowly. This is a juniper or red cedar.
Now that's a lot older than it looks. You know, at the nursery that looks like about 5 years old. But what do you think it is?
This tree is growing in soil, so it's growing a little faster than others that are that height, but it could easily be over 50 years in age.
50 years.
We're standing here under somewhat the shade of some bigger junipers, and right here you can get a closer look at the bark, the way it shreds here. This in turn is used by animals in their nests, and the bark has quite a convoluted look where the different branches that were growing still are evident by the wood as it has grown around it, working its way up the bark.
Now, why would that ant be going up there other than traveling? Does it get food out of here, the sap or anything?
Yes, ants are using trees to get to different food sources. Sometimes they'll have insects that they're capturing in a tree bough, They may not necessarily be utilizing much from the tree itself, but it's out hunting, looking for other foods. Where its colony might be could be hundreds of feet from us, and there's a worker out on a patrol. If it was a bigger black ant than the one that we saw, it might be one that would have a colony right in the tree, like the carpenter ants, but that was not of that type. Closer look at the leaves over here. They have a nice fragrance as well, and it's somewhat citrusy, kind of like a Christmas tree smell, and citrus together. It's kind of fragrant.
And this is a juniper.
Yeah, the juniper is red in the bark a little bit, but most of the reason for calling it the red juniper is in its wood, like a deep hue of not quite maroon, but a definite red tinge to it.
That's why it's then called the red juniper.
The red juniper, red cedar, it's the wood, the heartwood.
Now, I always was under the impression that cedar was tied in with the arborvitae type
Well,
of tree.
that's the interesting thing. As people came to this country and looked out on such great views as what we're standing by here, they saw things that reminded them of things they saw in their home countries and applied the same name to other things. So in this country, we have red cedar, which is in the genus Juniperus. We also have arborvitae, which is sometimes called white cedar, which is in the genus Thuya. Along the Atlantic coast, there's another Atlantic white cedar, which is in the genus Chamaecyparis. And the only true cedar lives around the Mediterranean in the genus Cedrus. And it looks similar to these other evergreens, and so the common name was just applied, which botanically makes it very confusing to use those common names, because their fruit, their habit is very different. They belong to different genera, and consequently are not so similar when you're looking at them botanically. Get a little peek right through here, a closer look out to the Hogsback. Once again, you can see some roots of another juniper as it's silhouetted against the shadows on the water. And you're looking down over 300 feet and scanning across the floodplain there. This would all be underwater, including that entire ridge in the distance when the dam is full. We're just a couple miles upstream from the dam, and the water level would be nearly 150 feet deep when the dam is full. You can kind of see how there's trees out along the top of the ridge, and then as you look down the ridge, there's no big trees. And those trees that are at the top had just enough of their tree tops out of water so that they did not die in '72. That was a lake from this side to the other side then.
In the Hurricane Agnes, 1972,
Yep.
This entire basin was filled with water?
Yep, 25 years ago, Hurricane Agnes, 4 feet from the top of the spillway, created a lake, and to this day you can see the forest come down and stop, and that's the high water mark. Because it was in June, the trees drowned. They weren't able to have gaseous exchange, and physically were killed.
Okay, now tell me, have Adam point out the Hogsback.
Well, right here as you come down from that ridge, and you physically follow along out there, it's a peninsula of land. If you look closely, you can see the river way beyond the shadows there. You see another stream coming down, and you can see a distant cliff. That is a little over a half mile away. But the river takes a bend towards the base of this cliff on the other side of it, swings way out here to the right against the cliff there in the shadows, and then comes below us here and swings off to the more proximate cliff. And that total bend, that meander, is about a mile in length. And this meander is a feature of an ancient river, a river moving slowly, something like you'd expect to see on the Mississippi. But here it is in a gorge. Gorges, rock walls, that's something you'd expect to see in a youthful, young feature. And so there's contrast, irony of it. You have old and new at the same time. This geologically is called an entrenched meander. And what is believed that happened here is the river, when it was setting this new course, having left the valley way off in the distance, you can just make out a faint hill. And that's where the river was prior to the Ice Age. And that valley was blocked. The river took a new route. And as it made that route, it wasn't going very fast because the ice was still here to the north. There were lakes backed up behind the ice. And the river up here at eye level where we're standing was making this new path, moving slowly. But as the ice melted away, exposed lower releases for the river was regenerated and cut down more. And in that same time frame over the last 10,000 years, according to glacial historians, the land is rising because when the ice was here, it sank underneath all that great weight and now is rising up. It's hard to picture ice.
Yes.
Way in the distance there are some clouds that cumulus clouds, the bottoms of them are often one mile high, and the ice was believed to be 1 to 2 miles thick that crushed across the land.
The ice was equivalent to the bottom of the strata cloud?
Those clouds that we're seeing right out there, those tops are towering much higher, but the bases of those are often a mile or so high. And any sunny day when you get those nice cumulus clouds, you look up and that's the kind of ice that was here that glacial historians believe created some of the features that mark New York State today.
And what time frame are we talking about in terms of?
The Ice Age has come and gone in terms of glaciers over the last millennium, and at least 4 different advances have crushed across this land. We may have been under ice this last time over 50, 60,000 years, and it melted off over a few thousand-year period, such that 8 to 10,000 years ago, this is all re-exposed, and all the vegetation returning and the associated animals. If there were people here before, whatever evidence they would have left of hasn't been found yet. They were completely annihilated from this area if they were here before the Ice Age.
Okay, I want to ask Adam to focus down on the flat floor of this, the greenery there. Now that greenery, is that trees or is that shrub or what?
It looks like just some small plants, and indeed, if you can see where that one log is, that's a tree, and next to it are some plants that are only 6 inches to a foot high, a little horsetail, and the rest there are small trees, willows, that are anywhere from 5 to 15 feet in height. And so deer and other animals could be out there right now and you would not be able to see them. This whole flat was farmed in the past. If you focus attention right back to the Hogsback, where it gets thin there at the top and you see some rocks exposed, look closely, you can kind of see a little diagonal line coming from there down going to the right. And that's a remnants of a road that went down the ridge, and there was a farm right out here, and this was all farmed land in the 1930s. Since that time, of course, the dam was built, the farm's land was purchased and acquired by the state of New York as the park that it is now.
It's fabulous.
What I think we ought to do is take a walk farther down so we can see that cliff in the distance a little closer. And we can also take a little closer look at some of the junipers. I have one tree down there that we can ponder that might be a centuries old.
Really?
And it's not very big. Oh, here's something interesting. Right down here in the wood chips.
You see that, Adam? You found that in the...
Yeah, let's, here, you hold, maybe hold this, and then I can hold it in my hand. This is a Scarab Beetle. The Scarab Beetle is just one family, and their antennae right here have a little clubbed 3 segments that make it look like a fist, and it helps recognize that group. And this scarab's larvae feed in wood, often in rotting logs. And this is one of our bigger scarabs. This family is only one of dozens and dozens of families of beetles that we have. And the beetles are a very abundant creature on the planet. Here on the underside you can see it's cloaked with these beautiful golden hairs. And these claws are hooked. It doesn't take much for them to hook right into my skin. which he can utilize those in climbing up trees and negotiating his terrain. He's really built like a tank. Insect's skeleton is on the outside as a shield of armor, and when they're reach the adult, that's as big as they're going to get. This isn't one that's going to be bigger when it gets older. That's it for it.
Okay, now there's no reason for a man to fear that type of thing or step on it.
No. This a creature that lives here. Like the little cicada, it has sharp claws, and it can hold on quite easily. Their role here is a creature. There are animals that feed on it. There are parasites, wasps, that are often feed on the inside of insects, and also in its feeding, it creates homes for other animals that would utilize the wood as it chews and softens the wood when it's feeding in logs. Beetles are our most numerous thing on planet Earth. It's been estimated that 1 out of 5 living things on planet Earth, that's all the plants, that's all the fish, that's all the fungi, algae, anything that's alive, 1 out of 5 living things is of some kind of beetle.
Is the majority of them Japanese beetles?
That's just one. I'm talking about
ladybugs?
Over 300,000 species that have been named so far, and estimates over 1 million species of beetles on planet Earth.
1 million species?
Estimates.
Yes. And I can name maybe 4 or 5.
Well, because beetles in general are smaller than humans. We're giants. It's been estimated that the average size of life on planet Earth is only a housefly. And so we tend to name things that are big because we're big. If we were going to list, if someone asked you to list all the animals you probably wouldn't have many animals on that list unless you were asked to think about that.
I like the way you think. You have a departure of thought that is so practical, so ideal, and so pragmatic. It's beautiful. It's beautiful thinking. It's very natural, very, very Native American.
Yeah, they're pretty much that same interconnectedness. That beetle doesn't stand alone. It's on the same circle of life that we ourselves walk upon. Get another view here into the canyon. And we're looking down here, a little bit of a valley where there are some plants that are able to get rooted in the soil. Some goldenrods that are in bloom. This is one of the first goldenrods to flower, and that's why it's called the early goldenrod. Sometimes you can see the first blooms at maybe the last week in July.
Is a goldenrod an allergen? Would anybody be allergic to that? Tie it in with ragweed or anything like that?
I've heard people refer to the goldenrod as ragweed. There is a plant called ragweed that has green flowers. Maybe on our hike we'll spot one. But it doesn't have any show to it. And it happens to be in bloom in the later part of the summer when the goldenrods start blooming. And so the goldenrods look guilty because you can see them. But their pollen is very heavy and smooth. And unless you're dusting yourself with the plant or underneath it, you're probably not going to get much pollen in your sinuses to be sensitive to it. And even if you were, it isn't spiny. Now the ragweed pollen is very spiny and very irritating when it gets in the sinuses.
That's not ragweed down there, is it?
Next to it, these plants with the small white flowers is the white sweet clover. And it's taking advantage on the disturbance. It's a plant that usually moves in and survives only for a few years in a disturbed area. And the disturbance here is we're on the edge of the gorge, and there are repeated landslides that open up the bank. You could see the roots are exposed. Yeah. Those roots don't grow through air, they grew through soil. And so that's how much soil that's been moved in their lifetime.
Talk about that oak tree that's down on the edge.
Well, that oak tree got started on the landslide, and it's hoping to grow there, but because of its position, it's going to be short-lived. It won't be able to live the 300-400 years that a typical oak could get. Just by its growing, it's going to create more mass, more weight, and physically facilitate the sliding of the land, which roots it's now growing into. Sometimes when this soil gets wet, a big tree that gets started on a bank like this will take enough soil with it, it'll slide right off the bank, drop hundreds of feet, and continue growing in a new spot down the bank. Often that's such a shock, though, they eventually die.
Oh, that's too bad. Is this a juniper that you were going to speak about?
Well, that's a little bit bigger one, but this one's rooted in the soil, and so it's growing much faster than the ones growing in the rock. It's older than the one that we saw before, but it's still probably less than 1 century old.
This is less than 1 century old.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
maybe 4 inches in diameter there,
Mhm.
and I would say 75 to 100-year-old tree. Harvestmen, and the harvestmen don't spin silk, and they only have 2 eyes instead of 8, and they actually are not even a spider, although they're generally thought of as a spider.
Adam, did you get that?
No, I picked him up again, but he's so fast moving, it's hard to keep a hold of him. You might notice how he's got his front legs out there feeling his way along before the rest of his body gets there. It's kind of his early warning. This harvestman only has one body segment. The spiders have 2 body segments. The harvestman only has 2 eyes. And with all this climbing, he could get a little bit alarmed. And sometimes they've been able to bite people. And their bite is more painful than a hornet's sting. But rarely do they bite, and usually you can handle them without any problem. It's a scavenger. It
likes hunting. Remains of plants.
The oak tree, and maybe originally there was a trunk here that rotted away and a couple sprouts came off, and they're now the trunks, and it's created a crotch that has collected water, and this is the main breeding pool of our mosquitoes. The water here is constantly moving because inside this water are the wigglers, the larvae of the mosquitoes. Let me try a little light here and just see, maybe you can get low with the camera and get a look in there, perhaps see those wigglers. And if not, let me just reach in there with my hand. There's a mosquito that just came in as an adult, just flew out. See if I can get a few of those wigglers out here where we can see them.
So, how many million are in that? How many
Oh, depending on the season, there could be a couple hundred.
Now, someone would say, why wouldn't you splash the water out and get rid of the mosquitoes while they're there hatching?
Well, we have a little over 1 million trees, and we would need quite a few people hunting for these little holes. It's a little beyond practicality. Plus, you'd be taking away the food of all the creatures that depend on mosquitoes for their livelihood. I've gotten this stirred up muddy, but I haven't been able to pick out any.
In addition to that, I see all these little holes going up the tree. Now, does that indicate that the tree is dying, that the woodpeckers would search a home out of this?
Well, any tree is mostly dead tissue. Something like 1 or 2% of the tree is alive. The bark is dead, the wood is dead, the cambium layer is alive, and many of the cells that make up the wood and bark live for a while before they, in turn, are utilized in the protection or the support of the tree. In this case, maybe near the base, entry was gained to the tree by ants, carpenter ants, larvae of beetles, and they've been working on the inside of the tree. And many years ago, a pileated woodpecker came here and made a hole. The trees continue to live and has closed that hole. These are years of scar tissue. This also is an old hole, and scar tissue is forming. This is a younger hole here made by a pileated woodpecker, and you can see the scar tissue here isn't as wide. And probably a different bird from a different generation may not have known anything about each other, those pileated woodpeckers. But this tree has served a number of years as a place where woodpeckers have come to gather food in the form of the carpenter ants and the larvae of beetles that are inside the tree. There's also farther up an injury of the leader trunk. A number of years ago, if we could determine the age of those two branches, probably somewhere around that many years ago, say 30 years ago, that top of that tree died. And as it has died, fungi got access, insects got access, and the eating and chewing of this tree from the inside out has been going on, that occasionally was discovered by the pileated woodpecker and served as food for a while.
Well, why did he leave? Because all of the bugs and the ants are gone? Or?
Well, there's lots of trees, and it just happened to snack on the ants that were in this tree for a little bit, and then moved on, found something else. And it's not the only tree in the woods to get food from. It was just one that it happened to work on.
So this does this ever become the home of a woodpecker, this hole?
No. A woodpecker that was making a nest hole makes it very different. It's a round hole, and they make a deep pocket. These are feeding holes, and they're blind and cone shapes.
We ought to just sort of photograph the root structure of that juniper. That's beautiful. It reminds me of the scenes from Arizona highways, you know, Doug? It looks like it's in the desert.
Yeah. In a sense, this is a desert-like environment where that tree is growing. It doesn't get a lot of water. When it rains, water flows off, and it's a very dry habitat. But it does have roots way back into the bank, unlike some of the trees farther down that are trying to grow on the rock. In fact, the plant that's just underneath that is another cliffside plant, like this fragrant sumac. That plant is usually only at the edge of the cliff. It's a plant called the buffalo berry. It's in the olive family, and there are plants that are planted that are similar to that, such as the autumn olive and the Russian olive. But this is a native plant that grows on the cliffs.
It hasn't been transplanted by man. It's rooted by itself, by seed.
Right. This is a naturally occurring plant in this habitat. It likes the disturbances of cliffs. It needs the full sunlight. Can't survive in the shadows away from the edge.
Well, then its existence kind of holds the bank together from erosion, doesn't it?
Yes, it's living in a dynamic environment by its own existence. It is lending only temporal stability. Landslide, the whole tree, the whole bank will go, and the plants will go, but somewhere nearby are other plants that can then recolonize that same bank when there's disturbance. So it thrives on the disturbance. It only can live in the disturbance. It is part of the dynamics of this whole bank.
No, I've never been to this spot. I've been around here 37 years, and I've never seen this area. This is called?
This I refer to as Conlon Point. The people that last lived in this area by the name of Conlon. This is referred to as Conlon Woods. And there are 22 square miles of what is Letchworth Park, and most people see about 1% of the park from the roads and overlooks. And this is only accessible by hiking out part of the trail that runs along the edge of the gorge here at the north end, the High Banks Trail, trail number 20. And this pans out across here against a wonderful scene. And that tree that I was mentioning is right over the bank here. This is a juniper, and a lot of the branches you see are dead there on the right. In those right branches, you can see how they're sweeping up. The wind right now is blowing in that direction, and continues to shape the tree. The tree is actually in the wind shadow of the cliff as the wind picks up these little shards of shale. You can see them here on the right underneath that purplish flower, for example, which is the knapweed. You can see those little flat pieces of shale. When the wind is really blowing, it picks those up and they act like little razor blades, and they just shear and shape that tree. Most of the tree's trunk is hanging over the bank below where we can see, and it's about 15 feet wide in the spread of its branches, and the tree maybe stands only about 3 feet high. The actual trunk you can't see where it goes into the ground because it's below the bank, behind where that oak tree is also growing. Its trunk is a little better than 10 to 12 inches in diameter. Now that tree is similar in the stressful location as another piece of wood that I have found that fell off the cliff. And when we cut and examined the growth rings, that tree turned out to be 435 years old. This tree might even be older. An estimate of 4 or 5 centuries would seem reasonable. And yet it's not as tall as a person. It's a tree that's growing out of the rocks and is surviving under a lot of stress. Off in the distance you can see the rock cliffs. These rocks that the tree is growing on are the rocks at the very top of the cliff. And those rocks are very vertical. They're a little bit harder rock, and they're called the Rhine Street Shale. Rhine Street was an area over in the Naples Valley, a grape growing area, where James Hall, the first geologist in New York State, studied the rocks and named this strata for that area. Beneath it, almost like a line, you can see the rocks are paler, and most of the fluting and shaping of that rock wall is in those lower sections, which are much softer and do not support such a vertical cliff. And those were named the Kashaqua Shale, when Kashaqua Creek was spelled with a C instead of Keshaqua Creek like today in James Hall's time. That's back in the 1840s, so some 150 years ago, when he was naming these rocks. These are the rocks that the dam is built into just downstream from here, and the Kashaqua Shale is our softest of all the rocks that are here in the park. If we were here on a sunny day, sometimes on the bank of the river, about midday when it's quite hot, some of the turtles that live in the muddy stretches of the river are out on the bank sunning themselves. They look like so many shiny rocks when they first come up out of the water. It's an unusual turtle in that its shell is soft. They call them the soft-shelled turtle because of that. And I guess because having a soft shell, their temperament seems to be a bit on the ornery side. They're quick to nip at your fingers. But late in the day, as the sun is climbing its shadows up that bank, if there were any turtles out sunning themselves today, they've probably returned to the water.
Well, Doug, I can't think of a more entertaining half hour and educational half hour that I've had this summer. I'm really appreciative, and I'm looking forward to all the other parts of the show that we put together. And I think the people in the Letchworth Cable Access audience are going to be very lucky and very happy to see this. But you just give us the rest of this information as the sun sets here in the west.
Sounds good. We got some swallows flying overhead. Cumulus clouds are making such big towers now, and just sit and be for the day. You might get a witness of some of the hawks in migration. We've seen osprey, bald eagle, broad-winged hawks, sharp-shin hawks, Cooper's hawks, many different kinds of hawks following the Genesee River. I suspect you won't have a lot of material.
This has been a beautiful half hour. Thanks again, Doug.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me along.
Okay, and thanks for watching. See you next time. On behalf of Doug Bassett and myself, Art Tamrowski.